Right, time for our first media panel of the year. And we're going to start with those plans in Australia to reform the laws that govern media and to increase the scrutiny of newspapers. Didn't go down so well across the Tasman. Welcome now to our media commentator Brian Edwards and listener columnist Bill Ralston. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for coming in this morning. If I could start with you, Bill. We heard at the top of the program from Graham Richardson, Richo, about how many disastrous policies there have been for Labor. This was perhaps one of the more disastrous, to put a government overseer over top of the media.
Well, in an election year, to take the media on is probably not the brightest move. Whether or not the public believes some of the hyperbole coming out of particularly the Rupert Murdoch news type of papers that were running, I mean, the accusations were this was a blow against the freedom of speech and everything else. They were really talking about doing what the English had done just a couple of days ago and bringing in one body that can actually rule and regulate across all media. In Australia, I don't think they even looked at the idea of trying to regulate online material. But the hysterical reaction from the Australian papers was just unbelievable.
And there was an irony in that, isn't there, really? Because it was almost an argument for having some sort of regulation. You know, so if you're comparing the minister to Stalin and Hitler and Mao and all the rest of it, you're not exactly being responsible, are you? But can I take up a point you made? Yes, to take on the media during an election year is very stupid indeed. But the issue arises as to what the general public feel about this. And my view is the general public don't give a stuff about the media, and they wouldn't give a stuff about media regulation. And it's possible, in fact, that if they did give a stuff, they might well approve of it, because journalists are held in very low regard worldwide.
And I think also in Australia, you've got a deep-seated suspicion of Rupert Murdoch and News International, News Limited, as well as Fairfax. Murdoch controls, I think, 70% of the Australian print media, and of course he's got television interests as well.
Well, let's have a look at how some of those Murdoch-owned papers responded. And here we have Ahmadinejad down the bottom right, the Iranian Stalin, Castro, Mugabe, likening a government overseer. They were never going to embrace this in Australia, were they, the media?
Well, the media were never going to embrace it, absolutely right. The public possibly might, had they been interested, might have embraced it, you know. But I mean, the reality, of course, is that you're dealing here with large, powerful companies who are driven by self-interest and money. And I think that tends to be forgotten. When people start talking about the freedom of the press, you've got to remember that freedom is a word you either have to be free to do something or free from something. Now, I agree that the press should be free from government or at least political interference, but not free to hack into people's emails, to hack into their phone calls and all the rest of the ghastly things that's happened in Britain. There, some sort of regulation is absolutely appropriate.
Interesting here, though, I mean, having watched what happened to Gillard and the collapse of that, most of those bills that were going through Parliament to regulate media, I don't think the New Zealand government is going to be very keen to do the same here. There was a Law Commission discussion paper out last year talking about the need for one overall body across television, radio, print and online. I think there's still work being done on that, but I can't imagine why a New Zealand government would.
Well, no right-wing government's going to do it.
No, well, Claire Curran has talked about a little bit of a need for regulation.
If Labor get into power, you would find like a British Ofcom or whatever you call it, you know, some major regulatory body, and that terrifies me, frankly, a politically appointed body.
But this stuff is still going on. I've just written about a case in Australia where the particular reporter, whom I won't name, went to interview this guy. We actually don't see the person's face at all. But what the guy has to say doesn't suit the reporter. So not only does he change what the guy said, but he uses his own voice as if it's that guy speaking. Now, you know, is there a need for regulation in Australia? Well, maybe there still is.
If that happened in New Zealand, the Broadcasting Standards Authority would take him out straight away and punish the network financially. I'm not quite sure how the Press Council would handle something like that with a newspaper.
Well, the Press Council can't really do anything about it. They have no power to punish, so what can they do about it?
It can order publication of it.
But that's not a punishment, really.
OK, then look at how the Standard reacted last year when we had that scenario whether there was a leadership coup going on between Cunliffe and Shearer, and it started here on The Nation that week of the Labor conference, that weekend, and then Paddy Gower picked up on it, and he was lambasted for basically this was a media-led hysteria, that this was actually driven by the media. It all been made up.
Well, I remember a shot at that time of, no, I'm actually thinking of something else. I'm actually thinking of Chris Carter, but we'll use that anyway. There's a shot of Paddy Gower chasing Chris Carter down the corridors of Parliament, which I thought was absolutely disgusting, really, you know. What is
television.
This? Made good television. That's not the sole reason for doing something.
But you talk about that, the leadership vote last year. Interesting, Shearer did exactly what Gillard did the other day. To head off the challenge, he called for the vote and called it early, knowing that Cunliffe didn't have the numbers. And it killed Cunliffe dead in the water, as it's obviously done the same to Rudd.
As to whether Cunliffe is dead in the water, I wouldn't put money on that.
All right, now I'd like to bring in an author who is with us this morning, David Hastings, who has written, welcome along, who's written a book, Extra, How the People Made the News. And this is, in essence, a look back, isn't it, on newspapers a long time ago.
Yeah, it's about the foundation of the newspapers in Auckland in the 19th century and the newspaper wars that took place here. And I've tried to demonstrate what the reasons were that some survived and some failed. They were life or death struggles, and the odds were stacked heavily in favour of death. A lot of people don't realise that there were about 30 attempts to start newspapers in the 19th century.
Wow, a
and
pretty raucous time.
Yes, and in the end only 2 of them survived.
Was there any similarity between the papers then and the papers now? I mean, were there any tabloid newspapers? Was there scandal and shock and horror in those papers?
Tabloid in the sense of the size of the page.
Yeah.
In fact, they started off more or less as tabloid-sized pages. But tabloid in nature as well. People often talk about tabloid journalism as though it's an invention of the late 20th century and people like Rupert Murdoch. In fact, those sort of racy, salacious elements of the news were reported in lavish detail in the 19th century.
Give us an example.
Well, there's a very good example of a divorce case involving a woman who bore an illegitimate child to the lodger. It was kind of, we laugh, yes. But it was a tragic, heart-rending story. It was actually Anna Karenina writ small. And the editor of the Southern Cross, a man called David Lucky, was scandalised at the intense public interest in this case. And he wrote an editorial saying how disgraceful it was. But then he published a supplement on the case, which was a full broadsheet page with no pictures, just words, about 5,000 or 6,000 words, going into all the details and every twist and turns of this tragic, sad story.
But that carried right the way through until the change in the divorce laws. I remember the New Zealand Truth relished every single divorce case that it could ever report for the same reason, and that's in the 1960s.
Yes.
How much politics was there in those papers?
They were intensely political.
Really?
Yes, they were intensely political. So much so that I think that a lot of the earlier writing about the 19th century newspapers see them as political instruments, solely as political instruments, and miss the kind of raffish, newsy elements that they contained as well.
But were they taking a political stance?
Very much so.
They were.
Very much so, yes.
A lot of those political arguments were in and around Māori issues. Did you find a lot of similarities between then and today?
Yes, I did, actually. There were conflicts over policy and differences over sort of superficial policy, but underneath the main sort of train of thought was that Maori should become like Pākehā. And this comes through very, very clearly. It's all about assimilation.
Just to come to the mechanics of it, how did you get the news in those days? I mean, you couldn't telephone someone or look on the internet.
Well, in the late part of the period, you could actually. The Herald newsroom had a telephone in the early 1890s. It had a 3-digit number from recollection, and they were very proud about that. There was a telephone on every floor of this 5-storey building. But by a variety of means, the overseas news, of course, all came by ship. That was the arrival of a ship from the UK was a very big deal in New Zealand because it didn't happen very often. They did legwork just like we do today.
Hold on. How did they get to the ship? Did they row out to the ship?
They rowed out to the ships. The competition to get to the ships was absolutely ferocious. There were fistfights on the gangplanks, and there were races to get to the telegraph office first. And there was a guy called Henry Brett, who was the proprietor of the Auckland Star, who He was actually, before that, the shipping reporter on the Herald, and he was an absolute ferocious terrier for a story.
But there was a
Nobody
proliferation
compared
of newspapers in those early days,
There were.
wasn't there? But it didn't continue.
There were clusters. In the late 1850s, there were about 4 attempts to found newspapers, and then there was another cluster in the late 1860s, early 1870s.
We have to leave. Appreciate your time, though. Sounds fascinating, David Hastings. Looking forward to reading your book. Bill Ralston and Brian Edwards, thank you too, gentlemen, for your time this morning.